Hey everybody, I did my report on Martin Luther, and here's some biographical information. Martin Luther was born to Hans and Margaret Luther on November 10th, 1483, in Saxony, which is present-day Germany. Martin Luther's father worked in the copper mines and advanced his way up on the economic and social ladders to eventually become a successful entrepreneur. Luther's parents gave him a strict upbringing, complete with beatings. However, due to the climate of child rearing during his childhood, this method of parenting was not out of the norm. It was pretty average. So, overall, Luther's upbringing was not that much different than any of his peers' upbringings would have been. His parents shared the same beliefs and superstitions that were widespread among the populace at the time. But the curious aspect of this fact is that there's not a specific detail about his circumstances as a child and adolescence that would indicate the nature of the work Luther would go on to do in his life. His parents had strong affection for one another, and Luther felt a deep devotion to each of them until their deaths. And during the latter part of his life, Luther married a former nun named Katharina von Bora. I'm sorry if I totally butcher these names. I am doing the best I can. But anyway, Martin Luther and his wife lived a joyful life together. In fact, their marriage was so full of joy that Martin Luther often encouraged single men to settle down and get married. Luther's health began to fail in 1537, and during the winter of 1546, he returned to Germany to mediate in a dispute between two nobles. And after the argument, he began his journey home, but only made it as far as Eisleben, the town where he was born, before he died on February 18th, 1546. A little bit about his education. Martin Luther began his formal education by attending the cathedral school in Magdeburg in 1497, 1498, around that time, and he completed his basic schooling in Eisenach in 1501. He had many positive experiences during this season of his life. He was well acquainted with a couple of families, the Schaub and Cotta families, who were distinguished, pious, and cultured. And he also made many friends, some of whom he even remained close with for the rest of his life. And between 1501 and 1505, Luther completed his basic schooling in the liberal arts, where he mastered grammar, became acquainted with rhetoric and logic, and after finishing his Master of Arts in 1505, Luther had every intention to fulfill his father's hopes of becoming a lawyer, but before these plans of studying law could come to fruition, Luther was caught in a sudden and severe thunderstorm. And in his fear for his life, he called on St. Anna, who is the patron saint of the miners. And Luther swore that if he would be spared from the storm, he would become a monk. Well, later on, Martin Luther became uneasy about his decision for a short time, and he talked to his teachers about it, and they gave him differing opinions, but within a few weeks, he followed through and officially became a monk on July 17th, 1505, when he joined the Black Cloister of the Augustinian Hermits in Erfurt. Spiritual temptations were one of Luther's pinnacle reasons for entering the monastery. One of Luther's greatest personal struggles was also a theological one. Luther was aware of the fact that he was an imperfect sinner, and Martin Luther also believed that God is perfect and requires perfection and holiness from those who follow him. And a question that Luther often felt plagued with was how a sinful and imperfect person could be favorable to a holy and perfect God. He believed that by focusing on prayer after he entered the monastery, he would be able to earn God's favor. And this act falls under works righteousness, which Martin Luther would later reject. And this rejection was sparked after a pilgrimage Luther made to Rome in 1510. When he reached Rome and witnessed the worldliness and materialistic ways of the clergy who lived there, he was flabbergasted and absolutely appalled. The priests living in the heart of the Catholic Church seemed to be much more concerned with political advancement and material gain than they did with living their lives according to the teachings of the Bible. When Luther returned to Germany, he was completely disheartened by the actions of the leaders in the church in Rome. It wasn't until 1518 that Luther came to the conclusion that he had been reading the Bible incorrectly. The phrase that stuck out the most to Luther consistently was the righteousness of God. And every time he read a verse with that phrase, he was terrified. This was because, according to Luther's beliefs, it was this righteousness that sealed his fate as an imperfect and unrighteous sinner. Later on, Martin Luther came to the conclusion that he had been both correct and incorrect about his views on salvation. He concluded that God does not require perfection because it's impossible for people to be perfect. People's lives are justified by their faith in Jesus Christ, and this doctrine is at the root of Protestant theology. The Roman Catholic Church taught that bad deeds can be canceled out by performing good deeds, and ultimately this is the doctrine that led to the Protestant split with the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church believed that Jesus, the apostles, and the saints had performed so many good deeds that there was a surplus which could be distributed by God through the Pope, which led to the selling of the infamous indulgences, which is when a priest would sell sheets of paper that offered some good deeds to people who didn't have enough. So if a person died and did not have enough good deeds, they would suffer through torment in purgatory until their sins had been paid for, according to Catholic belief. And the family of the deceased could buy an indulgence on the behalf of their loved one, and this would save them from the torment in purgatory. So that was a huge selling point for these indulgences, and the money from that was profited off of them was used by the Vatican as the means to complete various projects, one of which being the building of St. Peter's Cathedral. And they were also used to as means to do some crusades. I guess I'm kind of blanking on how to say that. So anyway, Johannes Tetzel was a Dominican monk. He began selling indulgences in 1517 near Wittenberg. He was a great salesman. He played upon people's emotions and their natural fears of death in the afterlife. It was in response to Tetzel's activities that Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses, and on October 31st, 1517, he posted the Theses to the door in Wittenberg, and they were intended to be discussion points for a debate, but that debate never came to fruition. I thought that was a little bit strange, but no one wanted to come to see this debate, so it just never happened. Martin Luther's impact on the world today is not limited to his part in the Protestant Reformation. He strongly believed that Christians should be able to read the Bible on their own in order to come to know God and develop their own thoughts about Him. But for this to occur, people needed to be able to read the Bible in their own languages. And until this point, people had to rely on priests and scholars to educate them on the teachings of the Bible, because when the Bible was read in church, it was read in Latin, and the average person is not a scholar in Latin. So Martin Luther was the first to translate the Bible into German, which not only gave common people access to the Bible, but this process did more to help create the modern German language. Since Martin Luther translated the Bible into German, it's been translated into a multitude of other languages as well. Obviously, today the Bible is one of the best-selling works in the world, and that's partly due to the fact that it's accessible and palatable thanks to Martin Luther. And by translating the Bible into German, Martin Luther was also taking the first steps in promoting freedom of information by making an arcane text available and understandable to the average person. So this leads to the idea of Martin Luther being the first mass media figure. He became extremely well known at a very quick pace, even though he was not from a high social level. He was not a ruler, a dignitary in his own order, or a prince of the church. And still within only 2 or 3 years of publishing his 95 Theses, amongst other things, he also published a variety of pamphlets and things like that. He became the most published author in the history of printing. People were invested in what Luther had to say, and he was one of the first to expose propaganda, which is a trend we still see today and will continue to see, by exposing the indulgences as a way to profit for the church. That was how Martin Luther exposed the propaganda. So again, we see this in our lives today. It's very relevant. So I hope that you learned something. I hope you found it interesting. I did personally, and I look forward to watching the rest of your videos and learning something new.